Before laws came steel, before kings came fear, this is not a world of justice. Here walks Conan. The prophet stood on the execution platform with a smile on his face, and that smile told Conan everything he needed to know about the next 3 days. The old man's hands were bound behind his back, his body stripped to the waist, revealing ribs that pressed against skin like cage bars. But his eyes held no fear, no resignation, only a terrible certainty that made the watching crowd shift uneasily. When he spoke, his voice carried across the square with unnatural clarity, cutting through the jeers and catcalls like a blade through silk. He prophesied Conan's death, not in vague terms or mystical riddles, but with specifics that froze the blood. 3 days hence, at sunset, in the ruins of the temple of Erlick, the Cimmerian would die with a sword through his belly, and his blood feeding the cracked stones. The prophet named the sword, described its hilt wrapped in wire made from a hanged man's hair, detailed the exact angle of the thrust that would punch through muscle and organ to sever the great vessels near the spine, and then he laughed, a sound like wind through a catacomb, before the executioner's axe silenced him forever. Conan had come to Arinjun for work, not prophecy, but the old man's words clung to him like a second skin as he left the square. He was no stranger to threats or warnings, had ignored countless soothsayers and fortune-tellers in a dozen cities, but something in the prophet's certainty gnawed at him. The man had died laughing, as if his own execution was simply another piece of a pattern only he could perceive, and that laughter echoed in Conan's mind as he walked the narrow streets, seeking the tavern where his contact waited. The job was simple enough on its surface. A merchant named Varthes needed protection while conducting business in the ruins outside the city, negotiations with desert tribes who preferred the neutrality of abandoned places to the politics of urban walls. Good coin for 2 days' work, maybe 3, with a bonus if the talks concluded successfully. Conan had agreed before the prophet spoke, taken half his payment in advance, and a barbarian's word once given was iron. But now, as he gathered his gear and checked his weapons, the old man's words kept intruding. 3 days, sunset, the temple of Erlick, the sword with the wire-wrapped hilt. Conan had never heard of such a blade, had no intention of going anywhere near the temple the prophet had named, yet the specificity of the vision troubled him in ways he could not articulate. Varthes proved to be a rat-faced man with soft hands and eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze directly, but his coin was genuine, and his fear was real. He spoke little as they rode into the desert, accompanied by 2 other guards and a scribe who looked like the wind might blow him away. The ruins they sought were a day's ride to the east, pre-human structures of black basalt that predated the Hyborian kingdoms by uncounted centuries. The journey passed without incident, but Conan felt the weight of invisible eyes tracking their progress across the wasteland. The sky seemed lower here, pressing down with a heaviness that had nothing to do with clouds or heat. The very air tasted of copper and ash, and the horses grew increasingly nervous as they approached their destination, their ears flattening and their nostrils flaring at scents only they could detect. The ruins rose from the desert floor like broken teeth, their angles wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Shadows fell at impossible angles, defying the sun's position, and the silence was absolute, oppressive, as if sound itself had been banished from this place. Varthes led them to a central plaza, where the desert tribes were already waiting, lean men wrapped in dark cloth, their weapons obvious despite the pretense of peaceful negotiation. Conan took up position with his back to a wall, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt. The negotiations began, Varthes and the tribal elders speaking in a language the Cimmerian did not understand, their voices low and urgent. The scribe scratched notes on parchment with a stylus that made sounds like fingernails on stone. Hours passed. The sun climbed and began its descent, and with each passing moment, Conan felt the invisible threads of fate drawing tighter around him. The first sign of trouble came when one of the other guards, a Shemite named Caleb, collapsed without warning. No wound marked him, no poison showed in his lips or eyes, but he fell as if every string holding him upright had been cut simultaneously. The negotiations broke down immediately, the tribal elders backing away with hands on weapons, their eyes wide with fear that seemed directed not at Conan or the remaining guard, but at the ruins themselves. Varthes screamed for them to stay, his voice cracking with desperation. But the tribesmen melted into the shadows between the structures and vanished, as if they had never existed. The merchant turned on Conan, his rat face twisted with rage and terror, demanding protection, demanding answers, demanding the impossible. The Cimmerian ignored him, his attention focused on Caleb's corpse and the wrongness of its stillness. The second guard, an Argosian who had boasted of fighting pirates and bandits across half the known world, began to laugh. It started as a chuckle, low and uncertain, then built into peals of manic hilarity that echoed through the ruins in ways that suggested the stones themselves were joining in. His laughter had the same quality as the prophets had possessed, that terrible certainty, that sense of being privy to jokes the universe told at humanity's expense. Conan's blade opened the Argosian's throat before the laughter could spread, before whatever had infected him could take deeper root. The man fell still, gurgling, his blood pooling on stones that seemed to drink it eagerly, and the laughter stopped. But in the sudden silence that followed, Conan heard other sounds, whispers in a language that predated human tongues, the scrape of something massive moving through passages beneath the plaza. Varthes and the scribe huddled together like children, their earlier purposes forgotten in the face of primal terror. Conan grabbed the merchant by his expensive robes and dragged him toward the horses, the scribe following like a shadow. But the animals were gone, their tethers cut or broken, only hoofprints in the sand leading away in directions that made no geometric sense. Night fell with unnatural speed, the sun dropping below the horizon as if fleeing what the darkness would bring. And in that darkness the ruins came alive, not with movement or sound, but with presence, with awareness, with the sense of vast intelligence focusing its attention on the three humans trapped within its domain. Conan felt it pressing against his mind, seeking entrance, whispering promises and threats in equal measure. They ran, though running in the dark between those impossible structures was madness. The Cimmerian led, his instincts guiding him through turns that should have led to dead ends, but somehow opened onto new passages. Behind them, Varthes whimpered, and the scribe prayed to gods who had abandoned this place long before the first human learned to speak their names. The temple of Erlick appeared before them without warning, its entrance a mouth of deeper darkness in the shadow-choked night. Conan recognized it from the prophet's description, though he had never seen it before. Knew with absolute certainty that this was the place, the exact location where fate had decreed his death. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn aside, to find another path. But the ruins offered no alternatives. Behind them came sounds of pursuit, things that scraped and shuffled and breathed with lungs that had never known clean air. He drove Varthes and the scribe into the temple, following them into darkness so complete it seemed solid. His hand found a wall, followed it deeper into the structure, his other hand gripping his sword with white-knuckled intensity. The prophet had said sunset, and sunset had passed, but perhaps the old man's timing had been imperfect. Perhaps there was still room to maneuver within the constraints of destiny. The temple's interior was a maze of corridors that turned back on themselves, stairs that led nowhere, rooms whose dimensions changed when you looked away. Conan navigated by touch and instinct, keeping Varthes and the scribe ahead of him, using them as shields or bait, or simply because abandoning them would have violated some principle he could not name. They found the central chamber by accident or design or fate's cruel humor. It was circular, its walls lined with alcoves containing mummified remains that might have been human once, its floor a mosaic depicting scenes of sacrifice and torment rendered in tiles of obsidian and bone. And in the center of that chamber, driven point first into a crack in the stone, stood a sword. The hilt was wrapped in wire that gleamed dully in the phosphorescent light emanating from the walls. Wire made from a hanged man's hair, Conan knew without touching it, knew because the prophet had described it exactly, knew because this was the blade that fate had chosen for his killing. Varthes saw the sword and lunged for it with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for driftwood. His soft hands closed around the hilt, jerked it free from the stone, and in that moment, the merchant's face transformed. The rat features smoothed, the weak chin firmed. the eyes that had never met anyone's gaze directly now locked onto Conan with terrible focus. The thing wearing Varthes's body attacked with skill the merchant had never possessed, the prophesied blade moving in patterns that spoke of training and practice and muscle memory older than the current flesh. Conan met the assault with his own sword, steel ringing against steel in the confined space, sparks illuminating the chamber in strobing flashes that revealed the scribe crouching in a corner, his mouth moving in prayers or curses or simple madness. They fought across the mosaic floor, Conan giving ground because the alternative was death, because the thing in Varthes's skin fought with the certainty of one who knew the outcome. The prophesied sword sought his belly with every thrust, probing for the angle the old man had described, the specific geometry that would punch through muscle and organ to sever the vessels near his spine. But Conan had not survived the harsh crucible of Cimmeria by accepting fate's dictates. He had lived because he was stronger, faster, more willing to do what survival demanded. When the thing lunged with a thrust that would have fulfilled the prophecy exactly, the Cimmerian threw himself sideways with such violence that his shoulder dislocated against the wall. The blade missed his belly by a finger's width, skittered along his ribs, drawing a line of fire, and buried itself in the scribe's chest. The man who had cowered in the corner throughout the fight took the prophesied thrust through his belly at precisely the angle the old prophet had foretold. His blood fountained across the floor, feeding the cracked stones exactly as described, and he died as the sun touched the western horizon, visible through some crack in the temple's roof, died at sunset in the temple of Erlick, with the wire-wrapped sword through his guts. The thing animating Varthes's corpse stood motionless, as if confused, as if the universe's script had been disrupted. Conan did not give it time to adjust. His blade took its head from its shoulders, and the merchant's body fell beside the scribe's, both leaking their life onto stones that had drunk the blood of thousands. The Cimmerian staggered from the temple as the last light faded, his ribs screaming where the blade had scored them, his shoulder a mass of agony, but he lived. The prophet's vision had been fulfilled to the letter and broken in the same moment. Someone had died at sunset with the specified sword through their belly, just not the person fate had seemingly designated. Conan walked into the desert under stars that seemed to mock his survival, and he understood then a truth that would guide him through all his violent years. Fate was real, destiny was genuine, but both could be cheated if a man was strong enough, clever enough, willing enough to sacrifice others in his place. The cosmos wrote its scripts, but it did not account for barbarians who refused to play their assigned roles. The wounds would heal, the shoulder would be reset, the memory of the prophet's laughter would fade, but the lesson remained, carved into his soul, like scars on flesh. Prophecies might be inevitable, but their interpretation was fluid, and a man who understood that fluidity could walk through fate's traps and emerge bloodied but unbroken. Other tales wait in the darkness beyond the firelight, chronicles of those who defied the stars and paid the price or claimed the prize. The Hyborian Age spares no mercy for the weak, but it offers grim rewards to those strong enough to seize them. If you possess that strength, then remain. The sagas continue and the night holds secrets still.